The great house on the hill was a silent, stone giant against the iron-grey sky. It belonged to Lord Roderick Vale, a man whose name was spoken in whispers throughout the region. He was not a king, but he commanded the trade routes with an iron will, and men feared his temper as much as his power. Within its cold, echoing halls, the air was thick with unspoken rules and quiet dread. Servants moved like shadows, their eyes downcast, their footsteps hushed on the polished stone floors. The master of the house was a storm they all worked to avoid. In this world of shadows, a small, gentle light existed in the form of Mira Rowan. At 19, she was younger than most of the other staff, but she carried a quiet dignity that set her apart. Her dress was simple and worn, her hands red from scrubbing and washing, but her eyes held a softness that the house desperately lacked. She had been hired to clean and mend, but her duties had quietly grown. For Lady Helena, Lord Roderick's beloved sister, had fallen gravely ill after the birth of her son, and the frail woman could no longer care for the infant. The baby, Alden, was all that remained of Lady Helena's joy. Her husband, Geron, had been lost to a sudden fever months before, and the grief had weakened her further. So, it was Mira who now spent her evenings in the nursery, a small, firelit room at the end of a long, drafty corridor. After her long day of scrubbing floors, beating dust from heavy tapestries, and hauling water for the kitchens, she would creep into the nursery, her body aching with a deep weariness. She would check on the tiny boy, his chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep, and then she would sit in the hard-backed chair beside his cradle, humming soft hymns her own mother had sung to her. On this particular night, a bitter chill had seeped into the very bones of the house. The fire in the nursery's hearth, which had burned brightly hours before, had dwindled to a few glowing embers, its warmth a fading memory. Mira had finished her final rounds, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She had tucked the woolen blanket more securely around the sleeping Alden, her touch as light as a feather. The cold stone floor seemed to radiate an icy breath, but she was too tired to go down to the servants' quarters, too worried about the baby being alone in the cold. She knelt beside the cradle, her knees pressing against the unforgiving stone. She folded her hands and closed her eyes, her whisper a soft cloud in the frigid air. "Dear Lord," she prayed, "please wrap your healing hands around Lady Helena. Give her strength. And please, watch over Lord Roderick. Ease the burden he carries. Show him your mercy." The prayer finished, a profound tiredness washed over her. She meant only to rest her head for a moment against the side of the cradle, but sleep, swift and deep, claimed her. She slid gently to the floor, curling into a small, shivering ball, her body between the cradle and the dying fire. It was past midnight when Lord Roderick Vale decided to check on his nephew. He moved through the shadowy corridors of his own home like a stranger, his boots sounding too loud in the silence. His mind was a whirlwind of troubles, a disputed shipment, a rival's threat, the constant, gnawing worry for his dying sister. He pushed the heavy nursery door open, its groan echoing in the quiet room. His eyes, sharp and used to assessing danger, scanned the scene instantly. He saw the dead fire. He saw the baby, safe and sleeping. And then he saw the maid, Mira, lying on the cold, hard floor, fast asleep. A cold anger, swift and unreasonable, flared within him. He was a man surrounded by people who wanted something from him, his money, his influence, his favor. He saw deceit everywhere. To him, this was a performance, a carefully staged scene designed to win his pity. She was trying to show him how devoted she was, how self-sacrificing, all to gain some special treatment. He strode across the room, his shadow falling over her. "You. Go. Wake up," he commanded, his voice like cracking ice. Mira jolted awake, disoriented and frightened. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the tall, imposing figure of Lord Roderick looming over her, his face a mask of cold fury. "My lord, I am so sorry, I only meant to." "Be silent," he cut her off, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Do you think me a fool? Do you think this little act of sleeping on the floor will earn you a reward? That I will be so easily manipulated?" He looked her up and down, from her simple dress to her bare, cold feet. "You are a servant in my house. Do your duty and be gone. Do not presume to play these games with me." Tears stung Mira's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She bowed her head, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and hurt. "It was not an act, my lord. I only fell asleep. It will not happen again." Her voice was a trembling whisper. "See that it does not," Roderick said, turning his back on her to look into the cradle, dismissing her entirely. Mira slipped from the room, the sting of his words clinging to her like the cold of the floor. Later that same night, a frantic maid woke him. Lady Helena's fever had spiked, she was coughing, struggling for breath, and the household healer was at a loss. Roderick rushed to his sister's bedside, his anger from earlier replaced by a cold, gripping fear. He held her frail hand, listening to her ragged breathing, and a wave of helpless despair washed over him. He was a man who could command armies of men, but he could not command health for his only sister. He felt the weight of his entire world crumbling, and in his heart, he blamed himself for everything, for not being able to protect her, for the harshness of his life, for the coldness of his house. In the days that followed, the house grew even more somber. Lord Roderick became a ghost in his own halls, his face grim, his temper shorter than ever. But Mira, despite the public humiliation, did not change. If anything, she became more devoted. She was seen carrying warm broth to Lady Helena's room, her steps quiet and sure. She was heard singing softly to baby Alden in the garden, her voice a gentle murmur among the rose bushes. She did her work with a quiet efficiency, never complaining, never seeking attention. She was a portrait of steadfast kindness in a gallery of fear. Roderick began to notice. He would see her from his study window, patiently walking with Alden in the weak sunlight. He would hear reports from the cook that Mira had taken her own meal to a sickly scullery maid. The memory of his harsh words to her began to itch at his mind. He had called her act a game, but her consistent, quiet goodness did not feel like a game. It felt real. It was a mystery he could not solve, a strength he did not understand. One evening, burdened by thoughts he could not silence, Roderick found himself walking past the small, plain door that led to the female servants' quarters. From behind Mira's door, he heard the soft, steady murmur of a voice. He paused, something he would never normally do, and listened. It was not conversation. It was a prayer. She was praying for her family, for the soul of Geron, for the health of Lady Helena. And then, clear and unwavering, she prayed for him. And Lord, her voice came, soft but clear, I ask you to watch over Lord Roderick. His heart is heavy, and his burdens are many. Shine your light upon him, I pray. Show him that he is not alone. Amen. Roderick stood frozen in the dark corridor, the words settling over him like a warm, heavy cloak he had forgotten he owned. The silence of the house afterward felt different. It was no longer empty. It was listening. The days following Lord Roderick's discovery in the corridor stretched into a tense and weary week. The household moved under a cloud of shared anxiety, for Lady Helena's condition did not improve. She drifted in and out of feverish sleep, her face pale as moonlight against the pillows, and the physician could only shake his head and speak of waiting and prayer. Baby Alden became almost entirely Mira's charge. She moved her few belongings into a small antechamber next to the nursery, her world shrinking to the space between the sick room and the cradle. She fed him, rocked him, and kept him clean and warm, all while continuing her other duties with a quiet endurance that went mostly unnoticed by the bustling household. Roderick was a man trapped. He haunted the halls of his own manor, a lord of vast lands and powerful men, yet utterly powerless to save his sister. He would stand for long minutes outside her door, listening to her labored breathing, his hands clenched into useless fists. The memory of Mira's prayer for him was a persistent, warm ember in the cold fortress of his heart, but he did not know how to acknowledge it, how to even approach its source. He saw her, of course. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped with fatigue when she thought no one was looking. He saw the gentle, unwavering care she gave to his nephew, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir within him, not anger, but a deep and unsettling shame. One evening, a storm descended upon the region with sudden, violent fury. Wind howled around the stone turrets like a banshee, and rain lashed against the leaded glass windows in great, shuddering sheets. Inside, the household was gathered in the great hall when a maid came running from Helena's room, her face as white as her apron. "My lord. It's Lady Helena. She's taken a turn, she cannot breathe." The physician, an old man who lived in the nearby village, was needed at once. Roderick barked orders, but his men hesitated, their faces etched with fear as they glanced toward the roaring darkness outside. The roads would be treacherous mud, the forest paths swollen streams. It was a fool's errand that could easily end with a broken neck for a horse and rider. "I will go." The voice was quiet but clear. All eyes turned to Mira. She stood by the nursery door, her simple shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Do not be foolish, girl," one of the senior servants hissed. "You'll be lost in that tempest." "The healer knows me. I helped him with my aunt when she was ill," Mira said, her gaze fixed on Roderick. There was no challenge in her eyes, only a calm resolve. I know the path through the woods. I can go on foot where a horse cannot. Roderick stared at her. He saw the slight tremble in her hands, the very real fear she was mastering. She was not a warrior. She was a maid, slight of build and weary from work. Yet, she was the only one willing to face the storm for his sister. The last of his distrust shattered into 1,000 pieces. He gave a single, stiff nod. Without another word, Mira pulled her shawl over her head and vanished into the roaring night. The household waited in a silence broken only by the storm and Helena's ragged coughs from upstairs. Roderick stood at a window, seeing nothing but his own grim reflection and the lashing rain. Time stretched, thin and taut. He imagined her swept away by the wind, lost in the muddy darkness, fallen and injured. With each crack of thunder, his guilt grew, a heavy stone in his gut. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the main door burst open. Mira stood there, drenched to the bone, her dress clinging to her hair a wild tangle of wet curls. She was shivering so violently she could barely stand, but beside her, sheltered by her own body, was the old healer, his bag held high and dry. She had not just fetched him, she had protected him on the journey back. The healer hurried upstairs, and the servants swarmed around Mira, wrapping her in dry blankets and leading her toward the kitchen fire. Roderick could only watch, a profound and humbling respect swelling within him. This was not manipulation. This was courage of a kind he had never known. Later, after the healer had administered a potent draught and Helena's breathing had eased into a more restful sleep, she woke for a few lucid moments. Seeing her brother sitting vigil by her bed, she reached out a thin, pale hand and took his. Her voice was a faint whisper, but her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. You push away the people God sends to help you, Roderick. You always have. Her words echoed in the silent room long after she had fallen back asleep. They echoed in his mind as he descended the stairs. They echoed as he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched Mira, now dressed in a dry, plain servant's dress, patiently feeding a spoonful of warm broth to baby Alden. The firelight played on her face, highlighting her youth, her tenderness, the quiet strength that had braved a storm. He saw her clearly for the first time, not as a servant, not as a potential deceiver, but as a person of immense character. The next morning, he sought her out. She was in the nursery, folding Alden's small blankets. When he entered, she immediately stilled, her posture wary, expecting another reprimand. Mira, he began, his voice unusually hesitant. He looked not at her, but at the floor near his boots, as if the words he needed were written there. I was wrong. The night I found you here. I spoke to you with anger and suspicion, and it was unjust. He forced himself to meet her eyes. You have shown nothing but loyalty and courage. You have cared for my family when I was too blinded by my own burdens to see what truly mattered. I am sorry. Mira looked at him, her surprise evident. Then, a softness returned to her features, and she offered him a small, genuine smile. There is nothing to forgive, my lord. We were all afraid. Her easy forgiveness, offered without hesitation or condition, disarmed him completely. It was a currency he did not understand, this grace that asked for nothing in return. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred within the manor. Lord Roderick began to emerge from the fortress of his own making. He started taking his meals in the great hall instead of his solitary study. He would often find a reason to be in the nursery or the sunlit garden when Mira was there with Alden. At first, their conversations were practical, concerning his sister's health or the baby's well-being. But slowly, they deepened. He found himself asking her questions, drawn by her calm perspective. He asked about her faith, and she spoke not of strict rules, but of a God who was like a loving father, a shelter in a storm. He, in turn, confessed things he had never told another soul. He spoke of the weight of his responsibilities, the constant vigilance it took to maintain his position, the loneliness that was the price of his power. One afternoon, standing by the garden wall, the words tumbled out, raw and honest. I know how to fight enemies, Mira. I know how to command men and win a dispute. But I don't know how to protect my own heart from the cold. I fear it has turned to stone. Mira listened, her hands stilled in her lap. A heart that fears it is stone, she said softly, is still a heart that can feel. It is not yet lost. As Lady Helena regained her strength, day by day, she watched the quiet drama unfolding between her brother and the gentle maid with knowing eyes. One day, as Roderick helped her walk in the garden, she paused, leaning on his arm. That girl, she said, nodding to where Mira was showing Alden a blooming rose. She is a blessing this house never knew it needed. A blessing you have been too blind to see, brother, but I think your sight is clearing." Her words were the final key. That night, alone in his chamber, Roderick faced the truth that had been growing in his heart for weeks. He was in love with Mira Rowan. The realization was terrifying, not because of her station, but because of his own unworthiness. He, who had offered her only harshness, now wanted to offer her his heart. He was certain she saw him only as a master who had, perhaps, become slightly less cruel. The chapter of their lives closed with him watching her from his window as she lit a candle in her room, a single, bright point of light in the vast, dark silhouette of the manor, a light he longed for but felt utterly unworthy to approach. The realization of his own love for Mira settled upon Roderick not as a sudden, joyful epiphany, but as a heavy, solemn weight. It was a truth that demanded action, but an action so far removed from his world of commands and confrontations that he felt utterly adrift. He could not simply declare it. To do so would be to wield his power over her, and the thought of her accepting him out of duty or fear was a deeper torment than her rejection. For weeks, he moved through his life as a man in a dream, conducting his business, overseeing his lands, all while his mind was occupied with a single, complex problem: how to approach the one person who had shown him unconditional kindness without tarnishing that very quality. He began his courtship not with words, but with a profound and silent change in his own character. The servants, who had for years navigated the tides of his temper, noticed it first. Where once a broken vase would have brought a thunderous reprimand, Lord Roderick now merely instructed that it be cleaned up. He inquired after a stable boy's ailing mother and ensured the family received a basket of food and medicine. The fear that had clung to the stone walls of the manor began, slowly, to dissipate, replaced by a cautious and growing respect. He was learning, through observing Mira, that true strength was not in inciting fear, but in fostering loyalty. He watched her with his nephew, with his sister, even with the lowliest scullery maid, and he saw how her gentle authority inspired devotion, not dread. He knew he had to become a man worthy of her world, not force her into his. The first true step he took was one of immense personal significance. He ordered his carriage prepared not for business, but for a journey to the small, outlying village where Mira's guardian, her Aunt May, lived in a modest cottage. He went alone, dressed not in his finest lordly attire, but in respectable, simple clothing. The journey felt longer than any he had ever taken. When he arrived, the sight of the small, well-kept home with its herb garden and smoking chimney filled him with a nervousness he had not felt since he was a boy. He knocked on the wooden door, and when Aunt May, a woman with Mira's same kind eyes etched with the lines of a hard life, answered, he removed his hat and bowed his head. "Mistress May," he began, his voice formal but earnest. "My name is Roderick Vale. I have come to speak with you about your niece, Mira." Aunt May's eyes widened in alarm, no doubt assuming the worst. She ushered him inside the humble dwelling, her hands fluttering nervously. Roderick did not sit until she did. He then, with a painstaking honesty that cost him much of his pride, laid his heart bare before this simple woman. He spoke of his initial harshness toward Mira. He confessed his own failings. He described her courage, her kindness, her unwavering faith that had been a light in his dark home. "I have come," he said, his gaze steady, "to ask your permission, as her guardian, to court her. With the utmost honor and respect. My intentions are toward marriage, if she will have me. But that decision rests with her, and with your blessing." Aunt May listened, her initial fear transforming into stunned disbelief, and then, as she saw the genuine humility and deep emotion in the powerful lord's face, into a slow, dawning joy. She gave her blessing, her voice thick with emotion, on the condition that he would always protect her Mira's gentle heart. When Roderick returned to the manor, he did not summon Mira. He waited until the following day and found her in the sunlit garden, where she was teaching a toddling Alden the names of the flowers. His approach was quiet. He knelt, not on one knee in a grand gesture, but simply to be at her level, to look into her face without towering over her. The sight of him there, the great Lord Vale brought low in the grass, made Mira's hand still in her lap. "Mira," he said, his voice soft. "I have been to see your Aunt May." Mira's breath caught. 1,000 fears raced through her mind. Had she done something wrong? Was she to be sent away? Seeing her alarm, Roderick hurried on. "I went to ask her permission. Permission to court you. Not as a master courts a servant, but as a man courts a woman he holds in the highest esteem." He saw the shock bloom in her eyes, a disbelief so profound it was close to pain. "I know the gulf between our stations seems vast," he continued. "But I do not see a maid when I look at you. I see a woman of immense strength and profound goodness. I do not need a queen for my throne, Mira. I need a woman who carries light into dark places. You have shown me that light. And I would be honored, more honored than by any earthly title, if you would allow me to walk beside you in it. Mira was silent for a long time, the only sound the happy babble of the baby and the buzzing of bees in the lavender. She looked at this man, this feared and powerful lord, who had humbled himself before her aunt and now knelt before her in a garden, offering not commands, but a request. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he showed no one else. The fear and disbelief slowly melted, replaced by a warmth that started in her heart and spread through her entire being. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was a tear of joy. She placed her small, work-roughened hand in his large, strong one. Yes, she whispered. I will. The news spread through the manor like a warm, gentle wind. There was whispering, yes, but it was whispering tinged with wonder and a universal approval from the staff who had come to love Mira as one of their own. The courtship that followed was a quiet, deliberate affair. There were no lavish gifts or grand balls. Instead, there were long walks through the manor's wooded paths, where they spoke of their hopes and dreams. There were quiet evenings in the library, where Roderick would read to her, and she would, in turn, share passages from her well-worn Bible. Their love was not a sudden fire, but a deep, slow-burning hearth, built on a foundation of shared faith, hard-won respect, and healed wounds. Their wedding was held in the manor's gardens, under a canopy of blooming roses. Lady Helena, now restored to full health, stood as a witness, her eyes shining with happy tears, holding a healthy, bright-eyed Alden in her arms. The servants were not merely observers, they were guests, celebrating the union of their master and the woman who had been their friend. When Roderick placed a simple, elegant ring on Mira's finger, and she became Lady Mira Vale, it did not feel like she was being elevated to a title, but that the title was finally being bestowed upon a person who had always embodied its true meaning, grace, dignity, and love. The transformation of the house on the hill was now complete. It was no longer a fortress of stone and fear, but a home, filled with light and laughter. A year later, a new sound joined the joyful noise, the cry of a healthy newborn. Mira gave birth to a daughter, a little girl with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's dark hair, whom they named Isolde. The sight of Lord Roderick Vale, the once feared Mafia boss, carefully cradling his tiny daughter, his large hand supporting her head with a terrifying tenderness, was a testament to the redemption he had found. He looked at Mira, her face radiant with a mother's love, and he knew his journey was complete. Mira, now the lady of the manor, never forgot her roots. She used her new position not for idleness, but for purpose. She organized aid for the poor mothers in the villages, using her own understanding of hardship to guide her compassion. Baby Alden grew strong and lively, and he knew Mira not as a servant, but as the second mother whose love had sustained him in his first, fragile days of life. The story of the Lord and the Maid became a whispered legend in the region, not for its drama, but for its quiet truth. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet, the family walked together through the gardens. Roderick held little Isolde in his arms, while Mira walked beside him, her hand resting gently in the crook of his arm. A few steps ahead, a now steady Alden chased a fluttering butterfly, his happy shouts echoing in the peaceful air. They stopped at a vantage point, looking out over the lands that were now under a rule of mercy. They were a family, bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by forgiveness, and by a faith that had turned a story of rejection into a forever after. The cold floor of the nursery was a distant memory, a foundational stone upon which a house of warmth had been built.